Welcome back to Face the Nation and more with Texas Republican Will Hurd. So, Congressman, you ran in 2018. As you said, it's a very competitive district. You won. Hillary Clinton carried your district in 2016. Why not run in 2020? Are you afraid of the effect that President Trump will have on those prospects?
No, I'm interested in helping other candidates like me. I think I want to see a Republican Party that has more folks that look and sound and operate like I do. I think it's an opportunity for me to help phenomenal candidates like Wesley Hunt down in Houston, Texas. He cares about his country, served his country in the military, has a beautiful young family, worked in the private sector, and wants to continue to serve.
Congressman, you know
yes,
that
sir.
you know the way to do that is to stay, to raise money, to campaign alongside and say, he's joining me, not I'm leaving, and he needs to replace me.
Well, what I find interesting, and a lot of people have asked me that question, is that everybody thinks the end-all or be-all is actually being in Congress. The party is defined by the people that are in it, not necessarily the politicians. And so this gives me the freedom and flexibility to operate in other parts of the country. I'm also going to stay involved in that nexus of technology and law enforcement. You can do that outside of the halls of Congress. When you look at issues like artificial intelligence, artificial intelligence is important because whoever masters it is going to rule the world. And the most interesting things that's happening in that area is outside of the federal government. So I'm looking forward to continuing to serve my country. I left a job as an undercover officer in the CIA, a job I loved. I got to be the guy in the back alleys at 4 o'clock in the morning collecting on intelligence on threats to our homeland. I left that job in order to help the national security community in a different way by bringing my skills to Congress, and I'm going to be leaving the halls of Congress to help our country in a different way as well. So I'm excited about the next couple of months because we still have a lot of work to do in Congress, but I'm also looking forward to building a Republican Party of the future.
Before I let you go, John Ratcliffe, a colleague of yours, was for a very brief period of time suggested by the president to be the new leader of the Director of National Intelligence. He's now pulled out. How concerned were you about that potential nomination itself? And how concerned are you about the general state of the intelligence community without a leader and with the president and the White House appearing indecisive about how to replace outgoing DNI Dan Coats?
Well, John Ratcliffe is my friend. John Ratcliffe is someone that I've been able to talk to in our time on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He has an ability to digest vast amounts of information, which is a skill set that's needed within the DNI. And I'm sorry that this thing turned out the way it did. I think Sue Gordon, as an acting Director of National Intelligence, is an excellent choice. I've had the opportunity to work with her in the different roles she has played in national security. But this position of Director of National Intelligence has a lot of challenges. The existential threat that China is playing to us, dealing with disinformation and how the Russians were trying to influence our elections, and of course, continuing to deal with terrorism overseas and abroad.
Congressman Hurd, thank you very much, and thank you for staying for that extra segment. I want to let our audience know that law enforcement sources tell CBS News the Dayton shooter has been identified as Connor Betts, 24-year-old from Bellbrook, Ohio. Police are searching his home presently. Thank you for being with us, Congressman Hurd. As I said, we'll be right back with South Carolina Republican Senator Tim Scott. Welcome back. We turn now to South Carolina Republican Senator Tim Scott, who joins us this morning from Mount Pleasant, just outside of Charleston. Senator, good morning, and I want you to help our audience because you've worked through this, you've been through this as an elected leader and as someone deeply touched in a community that has suffered a mass shooting. Describe for my audience, for our audience, what El Paso and Dayton are about to go through.
Well, what a challenging time. Our prayers and our thoughts are certainly with both communities. In South Carolina, here in Charleston, my hometown, at the Mother Emanuel Church, a white racist walked into the doors, sat through a Bible study for more than an hour, and then executed 9 members. My friend Clemente Pinckney was the pastor. My uncle had attended that church for over 50 years, so I am intimately aware of the challenges and the sense of disillusionment that comes in the aftermath. The good news for our community was that our community came together through prayer. A lot of folks say that prayers don't matter. Well, I will disagree with them vehemently. Because of prayer, the 9 family members forgave the shooter and brought unity into our state in a way that we have not seen in the history of the state, frankly. The Civil War started in Charleston, and to have a white racist walk into a door of a black church to start, according to his objective, a race riot, to have the actual opposite occur because of the power of faith in that church and in our community was fantastic and phenomenal. Walking out of that situation, what we started doing was meeting and talking and finding out where the differences were so that we could challenge ourselves to overcome those differences. And we did something that I thought was incredibly important. We said to each other that when you hear someone who looks like you say something that is out of line or inconsistent or insensitive, make it your responsibility to respond to that individual within your own community. That really did resonate here at home, and it was very powerful and very helpful because when we're looking for ways to address the challenges that our nation is seeing all over the place, one of the things that we do, we must take individual responsibility and speak up when we hear something. Silence in and of itself is a part of the challenge. So we must speak up when we see things that are out of place, when we hear things that are inconsistent with that's in the best interest of our nation and our communities.
Senator Scott, on that topic, you mentioned silence, and that's not acceptable. I want to read to you a quote from a book that just was published by Tim Alberta called American Carnage. It relates a conversation you had with President Trump. I want to quote from it directly. I know what fear looks like. I think fear typically comes with anger and hostility. You're afraid that you're losing something, that you won't have something that you used to have. I think people who march with torches, who want to resurrect a thankfully dead part of who we were, these are people who are afraid. Trump took all this in, rarely interrupting. What can I do to be helpful? He finally asked. What would you say to President Trump this morning about what he has said, the atmosphere he's created, and in his words, what he can do to be more helpful?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that we need to take a step back from politicizing every event. This is an issue of human hate, something that resides in the heart and that is actually, unfortunately, because of social technology and the social media, we're seeing it connected to other folks who have hate in their heart as well. What I'd say to everyone, from the president to my house, is that we should take responsibility for how we respond to the situations. I'm thankful that the president's response to this situation has been clear and decisive. I would hope that we would always have that clarity and decisive response in the face of hate and rage and racism. But it goes beyond that. We have to build a better society, a society where we all see that we are in the same boat. Poking holes or shooting holes in that boat only leads to casualties. All of us will be the casualty. Everyone looks in this world to America as the city on the hill, the bright light within the stars. We have to act consistent with our values if we are to maintain the position, not as a superpower economically, but as a moral compass for this world to follow. I think we can do that. I know that we have done it, and I believe that we will do it again.
I don't know if you had a chance to hear him, but Sherrod Brown earlier on this program said he hopes the Senate will cancel the August recess, come back and address gun-related issues. Your colleague in South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, tweeted this morning he's now in favor of so-called red flag laws. Do you have any anticipation, Senator Scott, that that will occur? The Senate will be called back this August, and any legislative efforts will be undertaken, whether it's assault weapons ban, background checks, or red flag laws, or should they be?
Well, Garrett, that's a great question, and I don't have a clear answer for that. It's something that I would be happy to do. I'd happily come back to Washington to have a conversation about gun violence.
Right now.
I hope we do it in a very thorough way. I'd do it. I'd leave tonight. I'll go tomorrow. It doesn't matter to me. This is such an important issue, and an issue that we sometimes only get part of the picture because of the mass shootings. I heard one of your guests earlier talk about the fact that we had nearly 40,000 gun-related deaths in this country. That is a staggering number. And when you delve into the numbers, what you find is that 65 to 67% of those murders were self-inflicted. They were suicides. When you look at the 250 plus mass shootings in this country this year, about 17 to 20 of them led to the loss of 4 lives or more. About half of those were suicides and or domestic situations. We are in the midst of a mental health crisis that we have not truly identified. I am happy to talk about background checks. I've supported letters to the administration that eliminated bump stocks. I am willing to have that conversation, but let's make sure that we put a fine point on the actual place the numbers lead us, and wherever that goes, we should be willing to take a serious look at it.
Just want to make sure I understand you clearly, Senator Scott. Your message this morning to the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, is come back, bring us back, and let's have a conversation on these various issues right now.
Garrett, it is painful to watch the challenges that I've lived through, and to suggest that for some reason we're not willing to go back and confront this major issue in our nation. I reject that. I reject the notion that something is more important than saving lives if we can do so. I'm not going to suggest that we will find ourselves on the same page having the same answers from left to right. But I do think that it is an American crisis that we are part of, and that as leaders of this country, we have an opportunity to go back and deal with the issue. And I hope that we find the resolve to take apart the issue and not just deal with one silo. I am willing to look at the entire ugly picture and look for solutions that our nation desperately yearns for.
Republican Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, thank you so very much for your time. And we'll be right back with our panel. As we do every week about this time, we'd like to bring in our panel for some political analysis. Susan Page is the Washington bureau chief at USA Today. Jeffrey Goldberg is the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. Amy Walter is the national editor of the Cook Political Report and the host of the Takeaway podcast, on WNYC, which is not to be confused with my own podcast here at CBS known as The Takeout. God, that was a long way around for not very much. Anyway, David Nakamura is also a reporter covering the White House for the Washington Post. Good morning, everyone. I don't need to say it's a tough morning, and I don't want to go through one of these banalities about, well, we're all so concerned. I just want to get a sense from you collectively. I'll start with you, Susan. Our nation's been through this process before, and every time we ask this question, is there a moment? Is this a moment? What do you think?
If 249 mass shootings in the space of a year is not enough to force political change, why would the 250th one be? Jeffrey reminded me that he and I sat at this table, on this panel, the morning after the Tree of Life shooting at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and we had no particular answers then. And I don't know that we have any more answers now about why this would be the turning point that so many Americans say they want to see.
Jeffrey?
Well, you know, right after Sandy Hook, a number of people observed that what we learned is that the country will accept a certain level of child homicide in order to have the gun rights that we have in place and other issues. So things didn't change after that. So it's hard to imagine that things change after any particular event. This does feel a little bit different because it's the confluence of a gun issue and a racism issue, and both of those seem to be reaching a boiling point. But it's hard to say that this is a pivot. We might be pivoting toward an end to euphemism in some way. People seem to be tired of talking about thoughts and prayers. This idea of having a national conversation around every issue seems inadequate to the moment, but we'll see.
Amy, do you take anything of significance away from tweets this morning from Fred Upton, Republican, Michigan in the House, Lindsey Graham, Republican in South Carolina, talking about red flag laws, finding some place to reposition themselves within this conversation?
Well, I also think it goes beyond the legislative, and I think we all around the table know that too, that the issue really, when we're talking about the consequences of political rhetoric and where the incentives are, people like Will Hurd aren't coming back to Congress, in part, I know he didn't say this, but it can't be much fun to be somebody like Congressman Hurd. He was one of only 3 Republicans who sit in a district that Hillary Clinton carried. So now there will be, maybe, after 2020, only 2 left in districts that Hillary Clinton carried. Those are the folks that bring a diversity of ideas, who are there to sort of raise their hand and say, well, it might play in your district, but it doesn't play here, and to bring that kind of conversation. But that doesn't happen anymore. The people who are willing to compromise, those people have all been either defeated or they've left on their own. And so what that leaves us with is an incentive structure in Washington where it's all or none. I mean, this conversation in some ways isn't that hard to have, but we can't have it because there's no and or but into the conversation. It's either mental health issues or we have to get rid of all guns, right? There's somewhere in between here, and there's also the consequence of the rhetoric. And I think that's going to be, it's obviously been a big issue thus far under President Trump's tenure, but that there are actual consequences to stoking and inflaming. President Trump didn't invent this polarization, but the constant just stoking of it has actual consequences.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a president, I think in 2016, there was some general sense of if there was a president, given his conservative bona fides for President Trump, the way he campaigned, that he could somehow give cover to some Republicans on something like gun control, find, some common ground, as unlikely as that might be, this would be a possible president who could do something like that. He has shown no inclination to do so.
Right. The idea being Republicans will follow him just about anywhere, as will the base.
And I think what you're seeing, though, with this particular case, if this manifesto is indeed tied to the shooter in the case in El Paso, is that President Trump this is beyond an issue of mass shooting. It's now tied up into questions about white nationalism, about the president's rhetoric, and about Trumpism in an election year. So the idea that we could move forward and President Trump would be the one to give Lindsey Graham and others the political cover seems extremely unlikely.
I'm a little uncomfortable with the word manifesto. I think it invests a kind of credibility that this essay doesn't, I think, warrant. But be that as it may, and once authorities, and they're on this trail now, believe they can confirm that the two are linked. In it, it says, the increase in Hispanic population in Texas prompted his action, blames Democrat and Republican leaders and corporations for failing the country, specifies that neither President Trump nor any other presidential candidate inspired him, expresses support for the Christchurch shooter in New Zealand. Jeffrey, this is an impossible question to answer, but I'm going to give you a chance.
Oh, thank you.
Not what ought we conclude about it, but what does this tell us possibly that we should think about and maybe act on?
It tells us that another term that might be antiquated now is lone wolf. After you have so many lone wolves, it's a wolf pack. It's not connected in the same way as, say, ISIS or Al-Qaeda, structured organizations. But there is a common viewpoint shared by different white males in different parts of the world about the condition of the world. Social media has allowed this to grow mostly unnoticed. You don't need a terror organization anymore when people can connect their ideas to each other across social media, across the internet, and so we're in a completely different kind of challenge for law enforcement, where people are neither radicalized by organizational structures, but they're not self-radicalized either. There's so much help. And so, I mean, I agree with you on the manifesto. It's a screed, and what it is a screed, it's a pastiche of ideas that have been floating around in the netherworld of the internet, and these young minds are putting these ideas together, and some are taking action.
And we had a warning of this last month. The FBI Director Chris Wray testified before Congress that the FBI had investigated nearly 100 instances this year of domestic terrorism, and most of them were associated in some way with white nationalism. And the only reason this testimony didn't get more attention, I think, is because it was right before Robert Mueller was testifying about the Russia investigation. But that is a pretty sobering message. Nearly as many examples of domestic terrorism being pursued by the FBI as international terrorism inside our borders.
George P. Bush is the land commissioner of Texas, the grandson of George Herbert Walker Bush, the son of Jeb Bush. Very quick on Twitter to describe his career in Afghanistan as a naval officer. Quoting him directly on Twitter, there have now been multiple attacks from self-declared white terrorists here in the U.S. in the last several months. This is a real and present threat that we must all denounce and defeat. Amy, do you think that is singularly suggestive of the Bush family writ large? And do you think it will be something that Republicans, like Will Hurd and others, will rally around?
So George P. Bush is in Texas, a state that is obviously incredibly diverse. If he wants to run for higher office in the state of Texas, he understands and appreciates what that would look like, the coalition that you need to put together to win in a state like Texas, and the age that he is right now, he's much younger, knowing where we're headed in the future. So I think he reflects where the party needs to go. But right now, in the age of Trump, they are in a place where that's not true. I just wanted to give one statistic. Right now in Congress, Republicans represent 83% of the 100 districts with the highest share of native-born residents. So places that have the highest share of non-native-born residents are held by Democrats.
David, it sounds like George P. Bush is thinking about the future and is suggesting with this tweet, it seems to me, and to pick up on Amy's point, that though this may be the current trajectory, he does not believe it is the long-term trajectory.
Sure. I mean, there's Democrats who go even back to Obama days that talked about, trying to embed in Texas to help it turn blue. I think, though, more immediately, of course, I was reminded just that President Trump himself visited El Paso. At the same time, he gave a speech there. And if you look, I went and looked back at his speech. It talked about his immigration agenda, did not mention almost anything about the positive aspects of immigration, certainly, and also, recited a number of statistics that were inflated and inaccurate about the dangers of immigrants and undocumented immigrants. He called Juarez, Mexico, right across the border, one of the most dangerous cities in the world. He inflated the number of murders and violent crimes among immigrants. This is a president, if you think about it, too, beyond just talking about a caravan invasion, he talked about an emergency at the border that he had to act. And if you look at sort of the language of this, the screed, whatever you want to call it, that was posted online by potentially by the alleged shooter, it echoes quite a bit of that.
Jeffrey.
Just one note on George P. Bush. Let's credit him with electoral acumen, but let's also credit George P. Bush and other people in the Bush family and other Republicans with being genuinely horrified by the ethno-nationalist tilt of the Republican Party and especially its president. I mean, I think that there are large numbers of people, many of whom have left Congress recently, who don't like the way this is going and don't like the association of the Republican Party with a kind of white nationalism.
Susan?
We know over the long
40
term,
seconds.
this is a losing proposition for the Republican Party to give up on black members, to give up on Hispanic voters. But what we don't know is whether it works in the short term in next year's election.
Susan Page, thank you very much. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. As we leave, we want to thank the first responders and authorities who have acted so heroically in both El Paso and Dayton. And to the families and friends, neighbors, and acquaintances of the victims, we have our deepest sympathies for your losses. Margaret will be back next week for Face the Nation. I'm Major Garrett.